There's a stretch of county road near the bottom of Cape San Blas that doesn't sit on the ground. It sits on rocks. Granite boulders, brought in by barge and stacked into a mound along the Gulf side, holding up a two-lane road that has no other way to stay where it is. Locals call that spot Stump Hole. Drivers who don't know the history slow down there because the pavement narrows and the water is suddenly very close on the right, and then they speed back up, and it's over in 20 seconds. Underneath those 20 seconds is a fairly stunning piece of paperwork. The state of Florida keeps an official inventory of its eroding shoreline, county by county, marker by marker, and in that inventory, the west shoreline of Cape San Blas is described as severely eroded and identified as having the highest erosion rate along the coast of Florida. Not one of the highest, the highest. The first rock mound went in after Hurricane Opal in 1995 to protect that same county road. Storms in 2004 and 2005 chewed it up. Engineers came back in 2009 and built a heavier boulder structure to replace it. A few miles up the peninsula, the Air Force built its own rock wall in front of a road after Hurricane Kate in 1985, and Opal destroyed both the wall and the road 10 years later. And then there's the lighthouse, which is the part that tells you what kind of place this really is. There have been 4 Cape San Blas lighthouses. A gale in 1851 knocked one down. A hurricane in 1856 wrecked the next one so badly the waves were breaking against the floor of the keeper's house, which stood 8 feet off the ground. The brick tower that replaced it was undermined until it leaned, cracked, and fell in 1882, and it ended up standing in 8 feet of water about 200 feet offshore. The iron skeleton tower built after that was put up 1,500 feet back from the water in 1885. By 1890, there were 144 feet between the tower and the breaking waves. In 1918, crews picked the whole thing up and moved it about 1,860 feet north, and it kept its new address for almost a century. In July of 2014, the tower, the keeper's quarters, and the oil house were loaded up and hauled roughly 12 miles inland to a park in Port St. Joe, because there was no longer enough cape left under them to argue about. 4 towers, 1 coastline that keeps moving out from under them. And on the 10th of October, 2018, a hurricane came ashore just up the beach and cut 2 new inlets straight through the St. Joseph Peninsula, leaving part of a state park unreachable by vehicle. Water where a road used to be. It's the same sentence this coast keeps writing. That's Cape San Blas, and it's one of 15 places on a stretch of Gulf shoreline that people around here call the Forgotten Coast. The Apalachicola Bay Chamber of Commerce trademarked the phrase on the 1st of September, 1992, and the marketing pitch behind it was simple and true. This is the piece of Florida's Gulf Coast that the condo towers and the outlet malls skipped. Roughly a couple hundred miles of it through Wakulla, Franklin, and Gulf counties, with Tallahassee 90 miles inland to the northeast and Panama City 60 miles up the beach to the northwest, and not much in between except pine, marsh, water, and towns that have been getting by on seafood and timber for 150 years. 3 counties carry most of it. Wakulla at the eastern end, where the springs and the marsh are. Franklin in the middle, with the bay, the islands, and the oyster towns. Gulf at the western end, with the peninsula, the paper mill that closed, and the beach that a hurricane took apart. Add the 3 together, and you get around 60,000 people spread along a coastline that would hold several million anywhere else in this state. The thing worth understanding, and the reason I wanted to lay these 15 places out in order rather than by shock value, is that the emptiness and the danger are the same fact. Development skipped this coast because the land here is low, wet, unstable, and hard to insure. Those same qualities are what make specific spots on it lethal. Ask anybody who grew up here and they'll tell you that in one sentence, usually with a shrug. So let me be honest about the ranking before I use it. Counting raw deaths would be useless. Franklin County had 12,451 people in the 2020 census. Gulf County had 14,192. Places with that few people don't generate large casualty numbers no matter how dangerous they are, and a list built on totals would just rank population. What I've used instead is a combination of three things: a documented record of people being hurt or killed there, a physical mechanism that can be explained and verified, and exposure, meaning how easily an ordinary person ends up in the situation and how far away help is when they do. Where those three line up, a place ranks high. Where the danger is real but rare, or real but obvious enough that people avoid it, it ranks lower. And I'll say so. That last piece, the distance to help, deserves a number. The hospital serving Apalachicola and most of Franklin County is a 25-bed critical access hospital with a 24-hour emergency department. It is an important institution, and the people who work there are the reason a lot of folks are still walking around. It is also, by design, a small rural hospital. Anything requiring a trauma center means Tallahassee or Panama City, and from the far ends of this coast, that's an hour and a half of driving before anyone touches an operating table. On the islands, at a bridge. On some of them, at a boat. Then there's the water itself, which is where the physics come in. The Gulf floor off this coast is almost flat. In Appalachia Bay, the bend where Florida's panhandle turns into Florida's peninsula, the continental shelf runs out more than 90 miles, with a slope of roughly 1 foot of drop for every 5,000 feet of distance. Picture a boat ramp the size of a state. NOAA's own explanation of storm surge says a wide, gently sloping shelf allows a higher surge, and that concave coastlines produce higher surge than convex ones, and it uses Appalachia Bay as the example of concave. So this bend has both of the ingredients at once, the shallow ramp and the funnel shape. When a hurricane pushes water toward it, the water has nowhere to go, but up and inland. Behind the beach, the land is barely land. Elevations across the Woodville Karst Plain, the limestone province that runs from Tallahassee down to the Gulf, average around 20 feet above sea level, and much of the coastal edge is marsh at 1 or 2 feet. The rock underneath is riddled with holes. Rain doesn't run off here so much as it disappears, and it comes back out somewhere else, sometimes miles away, sometimes as a spring big enough to float a river, and the water is warm. Not warm in summer, warm in a way that matters biologically for most of the year, which affects everything from what bacteria live in it to how fast a hurricane can intensify in the last 12 hours before it arrives. That's the system. 15 places, one system, expressed 15 different ways. I've put them in the order the water travels, because that order is the argument. We start inland, where rain enters the limestone and goes underground. We follow it through the caves and the springs, out into the Blackwater rivers and the swamps, down the Apalachicola into the bay, along the marsh edge, and through the passes, onto the barrier islands, and finally out onto that shallow shelf and into open water. Each stop explains something the one before it raised. By the end, the definition of the word deadliest will have changed on you 2 or 3 times, and the last place on the list isn't a place most people would think to name at all. One more thing about the title, because it deserves a straight answer. The idea that locals don't talk about these places is only half right, and it's the wrong half that usually gets sold. People here know this coast at a level of detail no visitor ever will. They know which bar has moved since last fall, which cut runs hard on a falling tide, which road floods on a full moon in October with no storm anywhere near. What tends not to get said out loud at the Chamber of Commerce meeting or on the sign at the county line is the pattern that connects it all. Because a town whose remaining industry is people driving down to see the water does not lead with a lecture about what the water does. That silence isn't ignorance. It's economics and grief and a kind of practical fatalism you earn by living somewhere for 4 generations. Keep one thing in your head the whole way down this coast. One of these 15 places was, until recently, closed by law. Not restricted. Closed. For 5 years, it was illegal to take a wild oyster out of a bay that once produced 90% of Florida's oysters and roughly a tenth of all the wild oysters harvested in the United States. Something killed that fishery, and the argument about what killed it went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the court's answer was not the answer anybody down here expected. That story is coming. It sits at the middle of this list because it sits at the middle of the map, and because it's the clearest example of the thing this coast keeps doing to the people who stay on it. Some of these places kill a person in 4 minutes. That one took 10 years and took a town with it. Number 1 sits about 25 miles inland from saltwater in the pine woods south of Tallahassee, and from a hiking trail it looks like the least threatening landscape in Florida. Leon Sink's geological area is a piece of the Apalachicola National Forest with a few miles of well-kept trail through it. Families walk it. School groups walk it. There are boardwalks and a viewing platform. And along the loop you pass something like 18 named sinkholes, roughly 8 of them holding water and 10 of them dry. Some are shallow bowls in the leaf litter, some are wide green pools that look like somebody's farm pond that got lost. Then you get to Big Dismal. Big Dismal Sink is a hole in the ground with about 100 feet of near vertical wall between the rim and the surface of the water. The water then goes down about another 100 feet. Roughly 80 feet below the surface, there's a cave entrance. What's down there is the top of a plumbing system. And the reason it exists is the reason this entire coast behaves the way it does. The rock under here is limestone, and limestone dissolves. Rain picks up carbon dioxide from the air and from decaying plants in the soil, becomes very mildly acidic, and over tens of thousands of years, it eats channels and rooms into the stone. Eventually, a ceiling gives up and drops into the room below it, and you get a sinkhole. The Woodville Karst Plain, the province this sits in, covers something like 450 square miles from Tallahassee down to the Gulf, and it is full of these features: sinkholes, swallets, which are the places where a surface stream simply pours into the ground and quits being a surface stream, springs, where it all comes back out. That arrangement does something strange to your intuition about water. In most of the country, you can look at a landscape and reason about where the rain goes. Rain hits the hill, runs into the ditch feeds the creek feeds the river. On the Woodville Karst Plain, the rain hits the ground and vanishes, and where it comes out again depends on how hard it rained, how full the system already was, and which of several competing underground routes was open that week. Divers and hydrologists who have spent decades on this have found that when you put dye in at one point, it comes out at point A. Do it again under different conditions, and it comes out at point B. Same hole, different answer. You can watch that happen in the open too. Not far from here, a creek runs across the flat woods and then simply ends, pouring into a hole in the ground and continuing its journey out of sight. The St. Mark's River does the equivalent trick further east, dropping underground and surfacing again a short distance later, which is why there's a place on the map called Natural Bridge, where a road crosses a river that isn't there. A Civil War battle was fought over that crossing in 1865 at a spot that only exists because of the way limestone dissolves. Now the danger, stated plainly, because I don't want to dress this up into something it isn't. Leon Sinks itself has no body count to speak of. It's a managed public trail system, and the sinks are set back and posted. And the overwhelming majority of the danger there is the ordinary danger of walking near a steep drop in the woods. Swimming isn't permitted. What earns it a spot on this list is that it is the clearest visible explanation of the mechanism that kills people further down the coast, and because the specific geometry of a Florida sinkhole is deceptive in a way that a cliff is not. A cliff announces itself. A wet sinkhole in flat pine woods presents you with a calm green surface, a bank you can walk right up to, and no visual information whatsoever about what's under it. The walls of these things are usually undercut, which means the rock you're standing on can overhang open water, and the vegetation on top can hide where the ground actually ends. The water is often much colder than the air, which is a real problem if a person goes in unprepared, because cold water shock will make you gasp and hyperventilate before your brain catches up. And in a steep-sided sink, getting out is not a matter of swimming to shore. There isn't a shore. There's a wall. There's also a version of this that has nothing to do with recreation. Cover collapse sinkholes open under roads, driveways, and houses in North Florida. And while the truly dramatic ones are rare and usually make the news, the process that makes them is running under this entire region all the time. Heavy pumping, extreme drought followed by heavy rain, and construction can all speed it up. None of that means anybody should be nervous about their own backyard. It does mean the ground here behaves like a working system, and the people who build on it plan for that. The last thing about Leon sinks matters more than the sinkholes do, and it's the part that connects to everything else on this coast. That trail sits directly on top of the Upper Floridan Aquifer, and the rock is so permeable that anything that goes into the ground here goes into the water with almost no filtration. There's no thick layer of clay doing you a favor. Fertilizer from a lawn, waste from a failing septic system, spilled fuel from a parking lot. On this plain that reaches the aquifer fast, and the aquifer is the drinking water and the springs and the rivers and eventually the bay. You can watch the consequence of that in one very specific, very sad way. And it's the kind of change that only longtime residents really register. The glass-bottom boats at Wakulla Springs, the next stop down the water's path, used to run all the time. That was the whole point of the place. You'd go out over the spring vent and look down through 100 feet of water so clear it made people uneasy, and see the bottom like it was under a pane of glass. Somewhere around the mid-1990s, the water started going dark more often. In recent years, those boats have run something like 1 or 2 days a year, and in some years not at all, because the water simply isn't clear enough. Divers and researchers working the cave system are still arguing about the exact source of the dark water and running isotope work to sort it out, with surface water and swamp drainage entering the basin somewhere as the leading suspect. That shape repeats all along this coast. Nobody did anything catastrophic. There was no spill, no disaster, no villain. A region grew, land use changed, water moved differently, and one of the most famous natural attractions in the American South quietly stopped being able to do the thing it was famous for. That's the first lesson of the Forgotten Coast, delivered by a hiking trail in the woods 25 miles from the beach. The water here is not a feature of the landscape. It is the landscape because the Vaughan is the landscapes moving through rock that can't hold a secret and can't filter a mistake. And everything that happens to it upstream shows up downstream wearing a different face, which is a fine thing to say from a boardwalk. It gets considerably more serious about a mile underground. Number 2 is where all that underground water comes back into the daylight, and it is one of the most beautiful places in the state of Florida. It is also, measured honestly, the most technically lethal environment on this entire coast. Wakulla Springs is a first magnitude spring, which is the top category, and it pushes something on the order of 200 to 300 million gallons of water a day out of a hole in the limestone and into the Wakulla River. In the early 1970s, it recorded a peak flow of well over 1 billion gallons in a single day. There's a state park around it, a 1930s lodge, with a marble lobby, a roped swimming area, a diving platform, and until the water started darkening, those glass-bottom boats. Divers have been going into the vent since 1930, when the Florida Geological Survey went down in helmets. In the 1950s and 60s, Florida State University teams brought up fossils. The spring has produced bones from at least 10 extinct mammals, including mastodons, from the last glacial period. And some of that material was sitting more than 1,000 feet back inside the cave. Long before there was a lodge or a dive platform, this was a watering hole where very large animals came to drink, and some of them died. The place has a Hollywood history too, which sounds like trivia until you think about what it implies. Hollywood came here in the 1930s and 40s to shoot jungle adventure pictures, and in 1954, the underwater sequences for one of the most famous monster movies ever made, the one with the Gill Man, were shot in this spring. The reason was simple. The water was clear enough to photograph through, at depth, reliably, and there was nowhere else convenient that could offer that. A film crew treated this spring as an underwater soundstage. That's the same water that now runs dark most of the year. Now the part that redefines the place. The cave behind that vent has been explored and mapped for decades by a volunteer organization called the Woodville Karst Plain Project, and their work has quietly turned this into one of the most significant underwater cave systems on the planet. On the 15th of December, 2007, two of their divers entered the water at Turner Sink, in the Leon Sinks area we just walked through, and came out at Wakula Springs. That connection alone created what was then the longest underwater cave in the United States, with something like 32 miles of surveyed passage. In January of 2023, after roughly a decade of looking for it, divers found a passage linking the 38-mile Wakula system to the 7-mile Chips Hole system, and the total went to about 45 miles. Read that as a piece of geography. There is a room and tunnel network under the pine woods of Wakula and Leon counties that runs for 45 surveyed miles, at depths that in places exceed 300 feet, entirely full of water, connecting sinkholes in one county to a spring in another. The town of Tallahassee sits on top of part of it. The dives are the kind of thing that sounds made up. Project divers hold the distance records for exploration below 190 feet, including runs of more than 25,000 feet each way at an average depth around 275 feet, and a one-way traverse between entry points of over 35,000 feet. On the 2007 traverse, Witsamwasen Skavon Sabras Abar, the actual swimming took roughly 7 hours, and the decompression took about 14 more. Divers on that project routinely plan for hours of decompression, and in some cases treat a full day underwater as the operating assumption. They breathe helium-based mixes because ordinary air at those depths would make them stupid and then poison them. They ride scooters. They stage bottles along the route like a mountaineering expedition stages camps. And these people are not thrill seekers. That's a caricature that annoys me, because the practical output of that work is a map of where this region's drinking water goes. When a county decides where a landfill can sit, or whether a subdivision's septic systems will end up in a spring, the survey data from these caves is what makes the answer knowable. They also spend a lot of time now measuring water chemistry and trying to figure out where the dark water is coming from. So why is it number 2 on a list of the deadliest places on this coast? Because the cave environment removes the single assumption every other kind of diving is built on: that if something goes wrong, you can go up. In open water, up is always available. Up is air, sunlight, a boat, a beach, a person on shore who can see you. In a flooded cave, up is rock. If your light fails, the darkness is total, in a way that people who have never experienced it consistently underestimate. If you kick the floor wrong, fine silt lifts into the water, and visibility goes from 100 feet to 0 in seconds, and it does not settle out on any time scale that helps you. If you get separated from your line in that condition, you're navigating a 3-dimensional maze by feel, with a finite amount of gas, and possibly with a decompression obligation that makes a direct exit impossible, even if you find one. The history of what that combination does to people is grim and specific, and it produced one of the more effective safety cultures in any recreational activity. In the 1970s, as scuba gear got cheap and available, more than 100 people died in Florida's underwater caves over the course of that decade. Overwhelmingly, they were divers with no cave training who swam into a spring vent because it was beautiful. And it was there. One September afternoon in 1974, 4 young men from Maitland, ranging in age from 20 to 24, drowned together while cave diving at Little River Springs, up near Brantford. That kind of event repeated across North Florida is what forced the issue. The response came largely from a Jacksonville math teacher named Sheck Exley, who was the first person to log 1,000 cave dives, who eventually made more than 4,000, and who did something that had never really been done for the activity. He collected the accidents and analyzed them for common factors. In 1979, he published that analysis as a book, and out of it came a set of rules that are now taught everywhere. There are 5. Training, meaning you don't exceed what you've actually been certified and mentored to do. A continuous guideline, running from the diver all the way back to open water outside the entrance, which is the single item most consistently missing in the deaths of untrained divers. Depth discipline, because gas consumption, narcosis, and decompression obligation all climb with it. Gas management using the rule of thirds, which means 1/3 of your supply to go in, 1/3 to come out, and 1/3 held in reserve for the emergency that involves sharing with somebody else. And lights, at least 3 independent sources, each with enough burn time for the planned dive. Divers remember the set with the phrase, "The good divers always live." Alongside the rules came the signs. At the mouths of a lot of popular Florida caves, and in the parking lots and the dive shops nearby, there are warning placards with the Grim Reaper on them, spelling out that people have died past this point and that no open water certification, no matter how advanced, qualifies anybody to continue. Some sites enforce a rule that untrained divers may not carry lights, on the reasoning that most people won't swim into darkness they can't see through. If you take one practical thing from this entry, take this: cavern diving, which means staying inside the zone where natural daylight from the entrance is continuously visible, within strict distance and depth limits, is a legitimate certified activity with its own training. Cave diving, which means going past that point, requires full cave certification, gear configured for it, and a plan built around failures. A person who is not certified for the overhead environment should never pass beyond daylight in any spring, on any day. No matter how calm the water looks or how many other people are doing it. That's the lesson the accident record has been repeating for 50 years, stated as plainly as I know how to state it. One more thing worth knowing, and it's the part that surprises people. In the early decades, roughly 9 out of 10 cave diving deaths involved divers with no cave training. Since the 2000s, that has flipped, and the large majority of fatalities now involve trained cave divers, because the untrained ones are mostly being kept out successfully, while the trained ones are pushing deeper, longer, and into more complex systems. The activity got more honest about who it kills. Wakulla itself, for what it's worth, is not a place anybody wanders into. The spring sits inside a state park. The dive access is controlled. The water is deep. And the standard for anybody working that system is well beyond the average certified diver. The swimming area is a swimming area, and it's a good one. The lethality here is structural. This is a first magnitude spring with 45 mapped miles of flooded passage behind it, and that passage is the actual coastline of the aquifer, which matters for the next stop, because when this much water surfaces at once, it has to go somewhere, and the somewhere is a river running through one of the darkest, most disorienting landscapes in the southeastern United States. Number 3 covers 635,000 acres of the Apalachicola National Forest, and specifically the part of it that hikers talk about in the tone people use for a bad hospital, Bradwell Bay. The forest was created in 1936, and it's the largest national forest in the state, spread across Liberty, Wakulla, Leon, and Franklin counties. Most of it is longleaf and slash pine on flat sandy ground, kept open by fire, and it is lovely country. Then there are the bays and the swamps, which are the low spots where water sits. And Bradwell Bay is the biggest and most famous of them. 24,600 acres of it were designated wilderness in 1975, and the designation is honest. There are no roads, no structures, and no help. The Florida Trail runs through it. That's the state's long-distance hiking trail, and this section is legendary in a way that through hikers describe with a certain amount of dark humor, because in an ordinary wet season, the trail through Bradwell Bay is a route through standing water, sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, sometimes deeper, through titi thickets so dense you push through them with your forearms. Titi is a shrub that grows in impenetrable stands taller than a person, and it does not care about your route plan. What makes a place like this dangerous is the opposite of what makes mountains dangerous. Mountains give you information. There's an up, a down, a drainage, a horizon, a ridgeline you can navigate by. A flat, flooded swamp in dense vegetation gives you nothing. No landmark, no relief, no reliable view of the sun through the canopy, and a footpath that is underwater and therefore invisible. Compasses work fine. People just stop using them because the human instinct is to walk around the obstacle and around and around, and every one of those small detours rotates you a few degrees off your line. The other half is temperature, and it cuts both directions. In August, this is a heat emergency waiting to happen. 90-something degrees, humidity near saturation, no breeze under the canopy, and you're working hard in water. In January, wading chest deep for hours in 50-degree water with a wet pack will pull a person's core temperature down faster than they expect. And hypothermia in Florida kills people who never once thought of Florida as a place where that happens. There are black bears in there, and alligators, and cottonmouths, and honestly, they are the least of it. The bears want nothing to do with you. The hazard in Bradwell Bay is the hazard of being 7 miles from a road, in water, unable to move quickly, with a phone that has no signal and no one who knows exactly where you meant to be, which is exactly the piece a person can control. So let me put the useful version in plain terms. Anyone hiking a swamp wilderness section like this should leave a written plan with a specific person, including the entry point, the exit point, and the time to call for help. Carry a paper map and a compass, and actually take bearings, since a phone is a battery in a wet pocket. Assume the trail markers may be underwater or gone. Check the water levels before going in, because after heavy rain, this section becomes a different and much more serious proposition. And turning around is a completely respectable outcome. And it's worth saying that this is not a beginner's day hike, dressed up as an adventure. Experienced Florida hikers plan it as an all-day commitment with a bailout. The forest has a second designated wilderness in it, Mud Swamp and New River, over on the western side. And between the two of them runs some of the best pitcher plant country left in North America. In late spring, the wet savannas out here fill with carnivorous plants, hooded pitcher plants, standing in ranks, sundews, butterworts, orchids. There's a scenic byway through part of it with pull-offs and interpretive signs, and most people driving the coast highway never turn inland to see any of it. This ground is poor, acidic, and wet, which is exactly why plants here evolved to get their nitrogen by eating insects, and why the timber industry, on the track next door, eventually decided that the only way to grow pine on ground like this was to drain it. That story is coming. Right at the eastern edge of the wilderness, the Sopchoppy River comes down through the pines, and it is one of the prettiest rivers in the South. Blackwater, meaning the tannins from decaying leaves stain it the color of strong tea. which makes it look sinister in photographs and makes it hard to judge depth or see what's below the surface. It carves down into limestone in places, and the cypress along it have those undercut, sculpted roots that look like architecture. The town of Sopchoppy sits above it. 426 people at the 2020 census. A railroad town from the 1890s that never got large. And because I promised the emptiness on this coast is not the same as absence, here's what those 426 people are known for. Worm grunting. You drive a wooden stake into the damp ground in the flatwoods, then you rub it with a flat piece of iron, and the stake shudders and moans, and earthworms come up out of the soil on their own and lie there waiting to be picked up and sold as fishing bait. Families in this area have done it commercially for generations, under permit, in the national forest. For most of the 20th century, nobody could explain why it worked. Then a Vanderbilt researcher tested it in 2008 and found the most likely answer. The vibrations closely resemble those made by a burrowing mole, and moles eat worms. So the worms do the sensible thing and evacuate upward. Sopchoppy throws a festival about it every spring, complete with a king and queen. I love that story. And not only because it's charming. It's the same physics as everything else along this coast. The ground here transmits things you can't see. What's underneath responds to what happens on top. The difference between a spring going dark, a sinkhole opening, and a bucket of worms coming up out of a pine flat is mostly a matter of scale. There's one more place in this forest that belongs on a list about death on this coast, and it deserves to be handled carefully because it is not scenery. Down near the tiny community of Sumatra, on a bluff above the Apalachicola River, the British built a fort in 1814 during the war with the United States, armed it, and then left in 1815, deliberately leaving the weapons behind. What grew up around it afterward was one of the most remarkable communities in North American history. Several hundred free black people, many of them formerly enslaved and many with families, living in and around a fortified position on a river, with allied native people nearby. For a short window, it was the largest free black community on the continent. On the 27th of July, 1816, a United States force attacked it. A heated cannonball fired from a gunboat reached the powder magazine, and the explosion killed roughly 270 people in an instant. It is often described as the deadliest single cannon shot in American history. 2 years later, the site was rebuilt as Fort Gadsden, and it was abandoned by 1821. Today, it's a quiet clearing in the National Forest with interpretive signs, and getting there involves miles of forest road. The reason I've put it inside this entry rather than skipping it is the thing this whole route keeps circling. Isolation is why that community could exist here at all. Isolation is why almost nobody stumbles onto the site now. The same emptiness that makes this coast feel gentle is what has always made it possible for enormous things to happen here without the rest of the country particularly noticing. That's the interior. Now the water leaves the woods, and it starts moving with purpose. Number 4 has the best name of any place in Florida, and it earned it twice. Tate's Hell State Forest covers 212,645 acres in Franklin and Liberty counties, sitting between the rivers, directly north of Carabel, directly behind the bay. If you drive U.S. Highway 98 along the coast, this is the wall of trees on your inland side for about 20 miles. The name comes from a story that gets told around here as history and is best labeled as local legend, because the details vary depending on who's telling it. Sometime in the mid-1870s, a homesteader named C.B. Tate went into that swamp after a panther that had been killing his livestock. He got lost. The version people tell has him wandering for 7 days and 7 nights, snake-bitten, drinking swamp water until he came out near Carabel, said his name and said he'd just come from hell, and died shortly after. Whether every element of that is literally true, the reason the story stuck is that anyone who has spent an afternoon in there understands immediately how it could be. Because the terrain does something specific to people, it's flat, it's wet, The vegetation is dense in exactly the way that blocks sight lines without blocking travel, so you can keep moving and never see anything. There's very little elevation change to navigate by, and the modern version has an extra trap in it that C.B. Tate never had to deal with, and that trap was installed on purpose in the 20th century. For about 40 years before the state bought it, this was industrial timberland. To grow pine on ground that wants to be swamp, you have to get the water off, so the owners ditched it. Aggressively. By the time Florida acquired most of the property in 1994, more than 800 miles of forest roads and ditches had been cut across it, and enormous areas of natural wetland had been converted to planted pine. 800 miles inside one forest. What that means on the ground today is a grid of nearly identical sand roads running through nearly identical vegetation, most of them unnamed on the average map application, many of them soft enough to bury a two-wheel drive vehicle to the axle, and a fair number ending in water. People get turned around in there constantly, and the classic version of it is undramatic. Why? A family drove in on a nice afternoon to see the dwarf cypress, took a couple of turns, lost signal, and now it's getting dark, and every road looks like the one they came in on, and the fuel gauge has opinions. Simple things prevent that, and they're worth stating. Go in with a full tank, tell someone your route and your return time, carry water for longer than you plan to be out, download offline maps before you lose signal, and if you're unsure of the road surface, don't find out. Forest roads here also close for prescribed burns and forestry operations, which is a live consideration and not a formality. As of this past January, the entire High Bluff coastal hiking trail inside the forest was closed for forestry work. This is a working forest, actively managed, and the schedule changes. Go for the dwarf cypress, though. There's a boardwalk out to a stand of pond cypress that are over 300 years old, and because of the poor soils and the water, have never gotten taller than about 15 feet. 3 centuries of growth in a tree you can look in the eye. It's one of the strangest and gentlest things on this coast. Now, why does a forest with almost no fatality record rank on a list of the deadliest places on the Forgotten Coast? Because of what those 800 miles of ditches did to the water, and because of who paid for it. Fresh water from this landscape used to reach the coast slowly, spread out, filtered through wetlands, arriving over weeks. Ditch it, and the same rain arrives fast, in a slug, down a straight line, carrying whatever it picked up. That changes the timing and the chemistry of what enters the estuary. The state's stated reason for buying most of Tate's Hell in 1994 was, in plain language, to protect Apalachicola Bay from the runoff coming off this altered ground. Restoration crews have been filling ditches and rebuilding natural flow since project by project, and roughly 107,000 acres of the forest are wetland communities they're trying to bring back. Remember the ditches when we reach the bay. The collapse down there usually gets blamed on one thing. The honest answer involves at least 4, and this forest is one of them. Number 5 is the strangest looking body of water on this coast, and it kills a very particular kind of afternoon. The dead lakes sit near Wewahichka, up the Chipola River, spread across roughly 6,700 acres. They exist because of an accident of sediment. The Apalachicola River carries a much heavier load of sand and silt than the Chipola does, and where the two systems meet, the Apalachicola's deposits acted as a natural dam, backing water up into the Chipola's floodplain and drowning a cypress forest. What's left is a lake full of dead trees, standing trunks, broken stumps, and thousands upon thousands of submerged snags, some of them just under the surface. In the low light, it is one of the most photographed places in the Panhandle. In a boat, at speed, it's a minefield. And it is exactly the sort of hazard that gets people hurt because it's invisible in tannic water and it doesn't move. Local anglers run it constantly and safely at idle on lines they know. Visitors with a rental boat and a schedule are the ones who find a stump with a lower unit. The lakes also have a management history that says a lot about this coast's relationship with fixing things. In 1960, a sheet pile dam went in to hold water levels steady. Lift gates were added in 1974. It didn't work the way anyone wanted, and by 1987 the sheet pile section was removed, with the supporting boulders taken out 2 years later. After the dam came out, the fish came back. Surveys counted 34 species before. By 1993, they counted 61. That's a rare thing in this story, so it's worth marking. A case where undoing the engineering worked. The swamp forest around here is also the source of one of the few luxury products that comes out of these counties. The tupelo trees in the Apalachicola floodplain bloom for a couple of weeks in the spring, and beekeepers move hives into the swamp on platforms to catch that narrow window. In a good year, tupelo honey from this river system is worth something close to $900,000 from a bloom that lasts less than a month, harvested out of a floodplain most people would call a mosquito farm. Wewahichka, the town at the edge of the lakes, has built a small identity around it. A couple of thousand people, a highway, a few churches, and a reputation among people who care about honey that reaches a long way past Gulf County. The beekeepers here work a floodplain that floods in a county that got hit hard in 2018, on a bloom that fails entirely in a bad spring. That's a decent picture of the economy here in one image. Very small windows, very specific knowledge, and everything depending on the river doing what it has always done. Which is where the water goes next, and where this story stops being about scenery. Number 6 is a river, and the case for putting it on a list of deadly places has almost nothing to do with drowning. Although the river will certainly do that too. The Apalachicola runs about 160 miles from the Georgia line to the Gulf. It begins where the Chattahoochee and the Flint come together behind Jim Woodruff Dam, and its basin, the whole Apalachicola, Chattahoochee and Flint system, drains something like 19,500 square miles across 3 states. Average flow is roughly 19,600 cubic feet per second, which makes it the largest river in Florida by volume of water delivered. The lower 30 miles spread into swamp and wetland, and the delta covers more than 230,000 acres. Botanists rank the floodplain forest here among the finest that survives in the southeast, and this basin has one of the highest concentrations of species diversity anywhere east of the Mississippi. On the water, the ordinary hazards are the ordinary hazards of a big southern river. A current that looks slower than it is, deadfall and snags along the cut banks, sandbars that shift after every high water event, tannic water you can't see into, and barge-scale infrastructure left over from the era when the federal government dredged this thing as a shipping channel. The river also drops a lot of sand where it meets the bay, which is why boaters here talk about the channel in terms of last month rather than last year. But the reason it ranks here is upstream, and it involves the city of Atlanta, a drought, and a Supreme Court decision that landed like a dropped plate in every seafood house in Franklin County. The geography makes that fight close to inevitable. The Chattahoochee runs right past metropolitan Atlanta, one of the fastest-growing urban regions in the country, and Atlanta drinks from it. The Flint runs through southwest Georgia's farm country, where irrigation pulls hard on it, especially in dry years. Both of those rivers meet at the state line, become the Apalachicola, and everything Florida gets is what's left after several million people and a great deal of agriculture have taken their share. It is a plumbing arrangement guaranteed to produce a lawsuit. In 2012, everything went wrong at once. A historic drought, a tropical storm's worth of complications, and upstream withdrawals combined to produce the lowest flows on this river in 89 years. That same year, the oyster fishery downstream collapsed. Florida sued Georgia in 2013, asking the Supreme Court to cap Georgia's water consumption. This is the kind of case that goes directly to the Supreme Court because it's one state against another, and it grinds for years. There were special masters, mountains of hydrology, competing models. The case ran for the better part of a decade. On the 1st of April, 2021, the court ruled unanimously against Florida. The opinion, written by Justice Barrett, held that Florida had failed to prove by clear and convincing evidence that Georgia's consumption caused the harm it claimed. The court noted that increased salinity and predation had contributed to the collapse, and that the causes of what happened in Apalachicola Bay remained a subject of scientific debate. In other words, the highest court in the country looked at everything and said, "You have not shown that this specific upstream use caused that specific downstream death." This is exactly the kind of place where a documentary can quietly turn a legal finding into a moral one. So let me keep them separate. The ruling did not say the bay was fine. It did not say fresh water doesn't matter to oysters, which would be biologically absurd. It said Florida's evidence didn't meet a demanding standard of proof for a remedy against another sovereign state. Those are very different statements, and the difference is why people down here talk about that decision with a particular kind of exhaustion. They spent 8 years watching lawyers argue about the thing they'd been watching out their kitchen windows. What the river does to this coast physically is easier to state. Freshwater volume and timing set the salinity in the bay. Salinity determines which predators and diseases can live on an oyster reef, because most of the things that eat oysters, including oyster drills and certain parasites, do better in saltier water. Sediment carried down the river builds and maintains the marshes and feeds sand to the barrier islands. A dam upstream traps sediment. That's not controversial as a general principle, and Jim Woodruff has been sitting at the head of this river since 1957. How much of the coastal sand budget that explains is still argued, and I'm not going to pretend it's settled. Here is what nobody argues about. The estuary at the bottom of this river was, for most of the 20th century, one of the most productive shellfish nurseries in North America. And it was productive precisely because of the mixing, the mud, the freshwater pulses, and the sediment. Everything that made this coast worth staying on came down that channel. It's worth saying what actually lives down there, because the phrase river basin makes people picture a drainage ditch, Gulf sturgeon, a fish that can run 6 feet long and has been swimming up rivers like this one since before there were rivers like this one, still spawn here. Along the bluffs upstream grows the Florida torreya, a conifer so rare and so restricted to this one stretch of river country that its wild population has been in serious trouble for decades. The delta at the bottom spreads across more than 230,000 acres of swamp, marsh, and creek. For most of the 20th century, the federal government dredged this river to maintain a barge channel to Georgia and Alabama, and the last decades of that effort were an argument about whether the traffic justified the cost and the damage. The dredging has largely stopped. The channel markers and cutoffs and old spoil piles are still out there, which is one more reason local boaters treat this river as a place where last year's knowledge has a short shelf life. The river is also the reason for the towns. Apalachicola was the third busiest port on the Gulf of Mexico in the 1800s, shipping cotton that came down from Georgia and Alabama on steamboats. That is a startling sentence to read next to a town of about 2,300 people. Whole warehouses of that trade are still standing on the waterfront, repurposed into shops and restaurants. And it produced one world-changing thing, which is my favorite piece of irony on this entire coast. In 1833, a young physician named John Gorey moved to Apalachicola. Yellow fever came through the port regularly, killing people in numbers that are hard to imagine now, and Gorey, working under the medical theory of his day, believed bad air caused disease, and that cooling a sick room would help his patients. He started by hanging basins of ice from the ceiling. Ice had to be cut from northern lakes and shipped down, which was expensive and unreliable, so he built a machine to make it. On the 6th of May, 1851, he received a United States patent for a machine that made ice by mechanical refrigeration. He died 4 years later, broke and largely dismissed. The technology he was fumbling toward became refrigeration and air conditioning. And air conditioning is the single largest reason modern Florida exists. More than 20 million people live in a subtropical peninsula because the air indoors can be made cold. And the development boom that machine eventually unlocked went to Miami, to Tampa, to Orlando, to Naples, to Panama City Beach. It mostly skipped the town where the doctor did the work. Number 7 is where the river finally arrives, and it's the place this whole route has been walking toward. Apalachicola Bay is a shallow estuary held in behind a chain of barrier islands, St. Vincent to the west, Little St. George and St. George across the middle, Dog Island off to the east. River water comes in from the north, salt water comes in through the passes, and the mixing zone in between was, for well over a century, one of the most productive oyster grounds in North America. The numbers on that are not modest. Apalachicola Bay produced roughly 90% of Florida's commercial oyster landings and something like a tenth of all the wild harvested oysters in the United States. Before the collapse, the industry built around it was estimated to generate on the order of $134 million a year in economic output for a county of 12,000 people. Oysters were the reason Apalachicola had a working waterfront, a seafood festival, a school with kids in it, and a class of independent small boat operators who owned their own means of production, which is rarer in American life than it used to be. And the work itself is nearly medieval, in the best sense. An oysterman stands in a small open boat with a pair of tongs, which are two long wooden shafts hinged like scissors with steel baskets at the bottom, and he opens them, drops them, rakes the reef, closes them, and hauls up whatever came with it. Then he culls on a board across the gunnels, keeps the legal ones, throws the rest back with the shell, and does it again. Hundreds of times a day, in winter, in wind, with wet hands. There are families in Franklin County where that's been the job for 4 generations. And the knowledge involved is genuinely deep. Which bar to work on which tide? Which shells will hold spat? What the water smells like when things are wrong. In the fall of 2012, things were very wrong. The harvest simply wasn't there. Boats came in with a fraction of what they'd expect. Then it got worse the next season, and the season after that. On the 12th of August 2013, the United States Secretary of Commerce declared a commercial fishery disaster in Apalachicola Bay. What killed it is a hard question, and I want to give you the honest version, because the simple version has been repeated so often, it's become the local catechism. Freshwater is part of it. 2012 produced the lowest river flows in 89 years, and low flow means high salinity in the bay, and high salinity brings in the things that eat oysters. Oyster drills, which are snails that bore through the shell, do well in saltier water, so do certain parasites, so do crown conchs and stone crabs. An oyster reef in a properly brackish bay is protected from a lot of its predators by the freshwater itself. And when the freshwater thins out, the protection thins out with it. Harvest pressure is part of it. After the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010, oyster grounds elsewhere on the Gulf were closed or in doubt, and Apalachicola was heavily fished, while it was one of the few places open. There is a reasonable argument made by researchers and by some of the oystermen themselves that the bay was worked harder in those 2 years than it could sustain. Shell is part of it, and it's the part outsiders never think about. An oyster larva has to land on something hard to become an oyster, and the best available something is old oyster shell. When you take oysters out and don't put shell back, you're not just removing animals, you're removing the future's foundation. Over decades, the reefs got lower and flatter and siltier, and the altered watershed is part of it, which is where those 800 miles of ditches in Tate's Hell come back around, along with everything else that changed how and when freshwater arrives. 4 causes, at least, braided together. That's why the Supreme Court's language in 2021 about the causes remaining a subject of scientific debate was, however painful, accurate. By 2020, the arithmetic was brutal. A fishery that once landed more than 3 million pounds a year was landing less than 21,000 pounds. And the dockside value had fallen by 98%. On the 22nd of July, 2020, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission voted unanimously to close Apalachicola Bay to wild oyster harvesting, effective the 1st of August, for up to 5 years. Think about what that sentence means in a town where the phone book is full of oystermen. The state closed the bay. Not a season. The bay. Shannon Hartsfield, a fourth-generation oysterman who had spent years in front of commissions trying to get help for the fishery, described it at the time as a scary situation and said they kept seeing the bay try to come back, but there was so little left. Sandra Brook, the Florida State University researcher whose lab has run the science on this system, put the biology in one sentence. The animals left couldn't produce enough spat to create the next generation that could support a fishery. Georgia Ackerman of the Apalachicola Riverkeeper called it a difficult decision and the best one available. Everybody agreed. That's the part that stays with me. There was no villain in the room. A whole community consented to the end of its own industry because the alternative was worse. What followed was one of the larger estuary restoration efforts in the country. More than $38 million has gone into the bay's recovery since 2019. Crews barged out material and laid it on the old reefs as culch, which is the hard substrate larvae need, and researchers ran controlled experiments to find out what works: oyster shell, fossilized shell, concrete, limestone rock, at different densities, on marked plots. One clear finding was that larger chunks of limestone performed best because they give larvae more surface to settle on, and they don't get scattered by tongs and currents as easily. Meanwhile, the town did what towns do, which is improvise. Some oystermen went into aquaculture, growing oysters in cages off leases rather than tonging wild ones. Some went to work on boats out of other counties. Some took maintenance jobs, construction jobs, whatever paid. One longtime oysterman, Roger Mathis, closed his oyster house and picked up work wherever he could find it. Farmed oysters filled part of the gap, and that shift deserves more attention than it gets because it changes the shape of the work. Aquaculture means leases, cages, floating gear, boats with davits, and a permitting process. It produces a consistent, clean, uniform oyster that restaurants love, and it can be done while wild reefs recover. It also requires capital, paperwork, and a tolerance for regulatory process, which is a different profile from a man with a pair of tongs and a skiff who has never needed permission from anybody. Some Franklin County families made that jump. Others looked at it and decided it was somebody else's trade with their product's name on it. The restoration also came with something less tangible and probably more important: a community advisory board made up of oystermen, dealers, scientists, local officials, and residents spent years hammering out a management plan for the bay. And the point of that structure was to produce recommendations that the people who actually work the water had agreed to. Anyone who has watched fisheries management anywhere in this country knows how rare that is, and how much of the failure in these fights comes from rules arriving from somewhere else, in a language nobody on the dock speaks. Meanwhile, the culture around the oyster stayed put, even while the oysters didn't. Apalachicola still holds its seafood festival every fall. Restaurants still sell oysters brought in from Louisiana, Texas, or from farms, and the servers still get asked the question, and they still have to explain. There's a particular kind of erosion in having your town's name on a product that no longer comes from your town. So where does that leave the ranking? This is the entry where the meaning of the word changes. And I'd rather not be cute about it. Nothing about Apalachicola Bay is going to kill you this afternoon. The water is waist deep across huge areas. There's no current that will take you out to sea. The danger here operates on a completely different clock. What this place demonstrates is that a coastline can be lethal to a way of living without ever laying a hand on a single person. A 4-generation trade, an entire local economy, and a specific kind of independent working life all died in the space of about 8 years, and the cause of death is still under argument. If you measure a place only by drownings, the bay looks harmless. If you measure it by consequences to the people who depend on it, it is the most consequential water on this coast by an enormous margin. There is also a literal health angle here that I'll come back to at the end. And it's the reason your oysters get tested and tagged and refrigerated the way they do. Warm, shallow salt water is a good place for a particular bacterium, and raw shellfish is one of the 2 ways it reaches people. That story belongs to the last entry on this list. For now, one more thing about this bay, and then we'll move east. For 5 years, from the 1st of August, 2020, it was against the law to take a wild oyster out of it. And then, this past January, that changed. Number 8 begins where the beaches quit, east of the Ashlakoni River. The sandy shoreline of the Panhandle gives out, and the coast becomes marsh, miles of it. Needle rush and cordgrass in shallow water cut by tidal creeks, with the tree line set well back and the land rising so gradually that from a boat you can't tell where water stops and ground begins. This is the western edge of the Big Bend, the great curve where the Panhandle turns into the peninsula, and it is one of the least developed coastlines in the continental United States. The St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge alone protects more than 83,000 acres of it. Established in 1931, there's a lighthouse out at the end of the refuge road, white, squat, and beautiful. First built in 1831 and rebuilt in 1842 after erosion threatened the original. Confederate troops burned out its interior in March of 1865 to keep it from helping Union ships. It was automated in 1960, and on Halloween of 2019, a replica of its original fourth-order Fresnel lens was lit in the tower again. Inland from that lighthouse, up along the St. Mark's River, there's a spot in the woods with some brick rubble and a historical marker. That's Port Leon. In 1837, people from a failing settlement nearby founded a new town there, right where the river met the bay. The Tallahassee Railroad reached it in 1839, and by the early 1840s, Port Leon was shipping something like 30,000 to 40,000 bales of cotton a year, hauled down from the plantation country in the Red Hills. It had 8 or 10 businesses, wharves, warehouses, a hotel, 2 taverns, a newspaper, an annual fair. It got a post office in 1840 and incorporated in 1841. Yellow fever hit it that same year, which was the fate of every Gulf port in that era. On the 13th of September, 1843, a hurricane came into Apalachee Bay and pushed a storm surge of about 10 feet through the town. That was the end of it. Not the end of that season or that year. The survivors pulled apart what was salvageable and moved inland to a new settlement called Newport. And the State Library and Archives of Florida now carries Port Leon on its list of extinct cities. A railroad town with a newspaper, gone in a night, and today it's a clearing in a wildlife refuge where a few bricks stick out of the leaf mold. There's a physical reason this particular stretch of coast does that to towns. And it's the reason this entry ranks where it does. Every ingredient for extreme storm surge is present here at once, and Noah's own explanation of surge names this bay while making the point. Surge gets bigger over a wide, gently sloping continental shelf because shallow water lets the storm pile it up instead of letting it circulate away underneath. The shelf off Apalachee Bay runs out more than 90 miles at a slope on the order of 1 foot down for every 5,000 feet out. Surge also gets bigger along a concave coastline, where the shape of the shore funnels water into a corner instead of letting it spread. Apalachee Bay is the textbook concave coast, and Noah uses it as the example. Then add the third factor, which is the land. There is no dune ridge here. No barrier island chain across this section. no high ground. The marsh is a foot or two above sea level, and it goes back for miles. Water that comes ashore on this part of the coast doesn't hit anything that stops it. It keeps going until it runs out of energy, and it can be a mile or 3 inland before that happens. The historical record of what that produces is consistent, and it is not ancient history. In March of 1993, the storm most people remember as the storm of the century, or around here simply as the no-name storm, came across the Gulf as an extratropical system with no hurricane name attached to it. It pushed water into the Big Bend shortly after midnight on the 13th. Inundation reached up to 12 feet in places along this coast. People woke up because the Gulf was in the house. 47 people died in Florida in that storm, and more of them drowned than drowned in Hurricanes Hugo and Andrew combined. Around 18,000 homes were damaged or destroyed statewide. In September of 2016, Hurricane Hermine made landfall just east of St. Mark's at about 1:30 in the morning, a Category 1 hurricane with winds around 80 miles an hour. It was the first hurricane to make landfall in Florida in 11 years. Even at that modest intensity, it drove inundation of 2 to 4 feet above ground from St. Mark's westward to Cape San Blas, 4 to 7 feet to the east along Jefferson, Taylor, Dixie, and Levy counties. And it set a record storm tide at the Cedar Key gauge, which has records going back to 1914. In 2018, Hurricane Michael made landfall 100 miles west of here, and this coast still took a beating. Surveyors found a high water mark of nearly 8 feet above ground inside the St. Mark's Refuge. In September of 2024, Hurricane Helene came ashore near Perry as a Category 4, moving unusually fast, and gauges around Appalachia Bay recorded water levels of nearly 7 feet above mean higher high water at Spring Creek and at Shell Point, with the very worst inundation to the east estimated at 15 feet above normally dry ground. Those are 4 separate events in about 30 years, from 4 completely different kinds of storm, all doing the same thing to the same bay, which is why the practical guidance for this coast is simple, boring, and non-negotiable. And I'd rather say it once clearly than dress it up. When an evacuation order is issued for a surge zone here, leaving is the whole strategy, and the time to leave is before the wind starts because the roads out are 2-lane and low, and they flood before the storm arrives. Storm surge is what kills people in hurricanes on this coast, far more than wind. In Hurricane Michael, 5 people in Florida drowned in the surge. Every one of them was elderly, and every one of them died inside a designated storm surge evacuation zone. That is not a statistic about carelessness. Older people are harder to move, have fewer options, and often have nowhere obvious to go, which means the practical version of this advice is about neighbors. If you live in one of these communities, the person who needs a ride out is probably 3 houses down, and they're not going to ask. People do live along here, and the way they live is worth describing because it's the clearest picture of the trade this coast offers. Shell Point, Spring Creek, Oyster Bay, Panacea, St. Indy, Marks, small waterfront communities, a few hundred people each, houses on pilings, boats in the yard, a couple of restaurants that have been in the same family for a very long time. Spring Creek in particular is a fishing settlement, where the seafood house and the dining room are the same institution. These are not resorts. There's no beach in the tourist sense. The shoreline is marsh, and you get to the water by boat or by dock. What that buys the people who live there is the best inshore fishing in the region, a working relationship with a coast most of the country has never heard of, and an unusually low cost of entry compared to almost anywhere else on salt water in Florida. What it costs them is everything I just described about surge, plus the certainty that some fraction of the flood insurance conversation is going to get more expensive every few years. One more thing about this marsh coast, because it is quietly one of the strangest pieces of water in North America. Off Spring Creek in the shallows of Appalachia Bay, fresh water comes up out of the sea floor. Spring Creek Springs is a first-magnitude spring group that discharges into salt water, and the broader bay has hundreds of submarine springs and seeps scattered across it, enough that researchers describe the freshwater input as roughly the equivalent of a major spring every couple of miles along this coast. The Woodville Karst Plain doesn't stop at the shoreline. It keeps going underwater, and it leaks. And in dry years, the system can run backwards. When the aquifer's pressure drops, salt water can push into the vents instead of fresh water pushing out. Divers working the Wakulla cave system have recorded more than a dozen high conductivity events over about 2 decades, and one working hypothesis has been salt water arriving from the Spring Creek direction, with isotope work underway to confirm it. Nothing on the surface tells you any of that is happening. It's a flat green bay with mullet jumping in it. Number 9 is a road, and the reason it's on this list is that the road keeps ceasing to exist. Alligator Point is a narrow sand spit hanging off the bottom of St. James Island in Franklin County, out where Ocklawakanee Bay meets the Gulf. Turn south off US 98 and you're on a 2-lane called Alligator Drive that runs the length of the point, with the open Gulf on one side and a shallow harbor on the other. Somewhere around 450 people live out there, in beach houses on pilings, a few older cottages that predate the current building codes by decades, condos near the marina, and a yacht basin that has been the center of local life for a long time. Bald Point State Park sits at the eastern end. It is a lovely, quiet, deeply unglamorous piece of Florida. The state's own erosion inventory describes the east end of the point between the Southwest Cape and Lighthouse Point as critically eroded for over a mile, and it names the reason in bureaucratic language that lands harder than dramatic language would: erosion. There has destroyed and continues to threaten private development and a Franklin County road. Destroyed. Present tense on the threatening. That road has washed out repeatedly. After Hurricane Hermine in 2016 and again after Hurricane Michael in 2018, crews were out there rebuilding sections of Alligator Drive. And the National Weather Service's own summary of Michael's local effects lists washout damage to US 98 and to Alligator Drive as part of the Franklin County impact. Anyone who has driven the point over the last decade has seen the pattern. Fresh asphalt in one section, older pavement in another, riprap, and boulders on the Gulf side where the sand is losing, sandbags stacked in front of somebody's deck. The mechanism is the simplest one on this whole list, and it's the same one that produced Cape San Blas. A barrier spit is a pile of sand that the ocean moves along the coast. Waves arriving at an angle push sand sideways in a process called longshore transport, and in a storm, waves break over the top of the spit and carry sand from the beach face across to the backside. That's called overwash, and in a natural system it's healthy. It's how a barrier feature migrates landward and keeps up with rising water. The problem shows up when you put something permanent on top of a thing whose survival strategy is moving. The sand goes where sand goes, and the pavement stays where you put it. And eventually there's a gap. What that means for the people on the point is a specific kind of vulnerability that has nothing to do with waves knocking down houses. There's one way in and one way out. If the road breaches in the middle, everybody past the break is on an island, and it doesn't take a Category 5 to do that. A strong tropical storm on a high tide, or one of those long fetch winter systems that pushes water into the bend for 2 days, can be enough. An ambulance can't cross a washout. A power crew can't cross a washout. And the nearest hospital was already 40 minutes away on a good day. There's a second layer to it that the erosion reports capture in a way local memory does. Back in 2008, a stretch of Alligator Point was added to the state's critical erosion list specifically to support the design of an adjacent beach management project. Then that beach restoration project, running from Alligator Point to Lighthouse Point, didn't go forward, and segments came back off the list. That's the rhythm out here. A plan gets drawn. The money, or the permitting, or the politics doesn't line up. The plan goes away, and the beach carries on doing what beaches do. The point itself is worth knowing for what it is on a normal day, because the hazard reads differently once you've seen the place. Alligator Harbor, on the backside, is a shallow, protected, grass-bottomed bay that has been used for oyster and clam work and shellfish research for decades. The Gulf side is a long, low, honest beach with almost nobody on it. There's a marina, a handful of rental houses, a state park at the eastern end with some of the best bird watching in the region, and the kind of quiet that people drive 3 hours for. The vast majority of days out there involve nothing more dangerous than sunburn. So the practical rule on a place like Alligator Point is stricter than the one on the mainland, and the residents know it far better than any outsider. When the county calls an evacuation for the barrier islands and the low spits, the window to leave is early because the exit floods first. The road across the low sections goes under before conditions get dramatic anywhere else. And the one thing that turns an inconvenience into a fatality is driving into moving water on a flooded road, which is the single most common way people die in flooding of any kind in this country. You can't see if the pavement under that water is still there. On this coast, sometimes it truly isn't. I'd rank Alligator Point higher than its casualty record and lower than its reputation would suggest. And the reason is exposure. The mechanism is documented. The road failures are documented. The isolation math is real. And there are a few hundred people living on the wrong side of it. But this is also a place where people are clear-eyed about the trade. Nobody out there thinks they're on solid ground. They're on a sandbar with a mailing address and they chose it. And every few years they rebuild the road and get on with it. There's a version of coastal life where that's stupidity. That's not the version I saw in the record. Along this whole coast, the pattern is people making rational, informed decisions with limited options. The house has been in the family since the 60s. The flood insurance situation is what it is. The alternative is leaving the only place they know. That's a choice, made with the facts in hand, over and over. It's the same choice this story ends on. Number 10 is a beach that looks like every other beach on this coast, and for about 4 years, it was one of the busiest and most miserable pieces of shoreline in the United States. Carabel sits at the mouth of the Carabel River, about 25 miles east of Apalachicola. 2,600 people. It was founded in 1877 by Oliver Hudson Kelly, who named it after his niece Caroline Arabella. And if the name Kelly rings a faint bell, it's because he also founded the Grange, the farmers' organization that reshaped rural American politics in the 1870s. The town incorporated in 1881 and became a city in 1893. It's the eastern terminus of the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway, which means that if you're running a boat from Texas along the coast, this is where the protected inside route ends, and you make a decision about crossing open water. Carabel's most famous attraction is a phone booth. In 1963, the police phone was mounted on a wall downtown, and people kept using it to make free long-distance calls. So on the 10th of March that year, the department moved the phone into an old phone booth and thereby created what the town has advertised ever since as the world's smallest police station. The original booth now lives in the local history museum. I mention it because it tells you exactly what kind of town this is, and because that sense of humor turns out to be load-bearing in a place with this history. Because in 1942, the United States Army took 165,000 acres of this coastline and built Camp Gordon Johnston on it. It opened in September of that year as the Army's amphibious training center. Over the next 4 years, roughly 250,000 men passed through it, learning how to go from a ship to a hostile beach. They practiced on these sands, and on Dog Island and St. George Island offshore, running landing craft up onto the bars, dropping ramps, wading in with packs and rifles. Infantry divisions that later went into Europe and the Pacific rehearsed here. Engineer brigades built pontoon docks and learned harbor craft work. Then in 1943, the camp shifted into training port and harbor units, And by the end of the war, it was processing men out of the army instead of into the fight. Ask why the army picked this specific coast, and you get the whole thesis of this list handed to you in a single answer. They picked it because it was empty, because nobody would be inconvenienced by live fire, because there were islands offshore to serve as objectives, and because the water was shallow and full of sandbars, in a way that resembled the beaches they expected to attack. Every feature that had kept this coast poor and unbuilt was, for that specific purpose, an asset. Those same features are what made the training brutal. A shallow, bar-laced shore means a landing craft can ground on a false bar well short of the beach with a trough of deeper water on the far side. A man coming off a ramp into what looks like waist-deep water can step into a hole. Add a pack, a weapon, and the surf, and the physics get unforgiving fast. Men who trained here remembered it as sand fleas, heat, mud, cold water in winter, and a general sense of being forgotten by the army. And there's a reason it acquired a reputation as one of the worst postings in the country. 3 infantry divisions rehearsed here, along with engineer special brigades, and the men who went through this place ended up on beaches whose names everybody knows. Very little of that is legible on the ground today. An installation that size needs barracks, mess halls, a hospital, ranges and roads, and almost none of it survives, because it was all built fast to a wartime standard on sand, and because this region does to abandoned infrastructure what it does to everything else, which is grow over it. After the war, the camp was broken up and sold as surplus. The officers' quarters became Lanark Village, which is now a quiet retirement community on the highway, where people live in buildings that were built for men on their way to a landing, and the ground itself kept a souvenir. In 2001, unexploded ordnance from the wartime exercises turned up in areas that had been sold into private hands, and specially trained technicians had to be brought in to clear parts of it. That's a real hazard, and it deserves the standard, non-negotiable guidance. If anyone ever comes across something on this coast that looks like military ordnance, whether it's on a beach, in the woods, or turned up by a bulldozer, the rule is the same everywhere. Don't touch it, don't move it, don't put it in the truck, back away the way you came, note where it is, and call the sheriff or 911. Age does not make these things safe. Corrosion tends to make them less predictable. The town also carries an older wound that connects to everything else on this list. On the 1st of August, 1899, a hurricane came into this coast and very nearly erased Carabel. Accounts from the time say that when it was over, 9 homes were left standing. Offshore, in the anchorage off Dog Island, up to 15 ships were wrecked, a dozen of them loaded with lumber, and another 40 smaller vessels were sunk or destroyed. The town rebuilt. Of course it did. That's what the towns on this coast do, which is why they're all still on the map with populations in the low thousands and building stock that dates from whichever storm they last rebuilt after. There's a museum in Carabel now for Camp Gordon Johnston, run largely by volunteers, free to visit, and it's one of those small local institutions that punches far above its weight. Veterans came back here for reunions for decades, to a beach where nothing at all marks what happened, because the ocean took the docks, and the sand took the rest, and the pines grew back over the camp roads. 250,000 men learned to invade a continent on a shoreline whose most advertised landmark today is a phone booth. Number 11 is visible from the beach at Carabel on a clear day, and getting to it is harder than getting to some parts of Alaska. Dog Island is just under 7 miles long and less than a mile across at its widest, lying offshore across St. George Sound. There is no bridge. There has never been a bridge. Access is by private boat, by a ferry that runs on weekends by reservation, or by air into a turf strip that opened back in 1930 and is about 2,700 feet of grass. There are no stores on the island, no restaurants, no public restrooms. There's electricity, trash pickup, a volunteer fire department, and a scattering of houses, and the majority of the island is owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed as a wilderness preserve. Everything a household consumes out there arrives by boat or plane: groceries, lumber, propane, a refrigerator. Everything that leaves does the same. What earns it a place on this list is the gap between how close it looks and what that distance actually costs when something goes wrong. 3.5 miles of open water is nothing on a calm July morning in a decent boat. It's a different proposition when a north wind comes down across the sound in February and stands up a short, steep chop, or when a squall line comes through in the afternoon, or at 2 in the morning when somebody's chest hurts. Emergency response to an island with no bridge means somebody's boat or somebody's aircraft, in whatever conditions exist right then. Weather that would be a minor annoyance on the mainland becomes the deciding variable in whether help arrives in 20 minutes or 2 hours. The people who live and stay there understand that arithmetic completely. They plan for it. They keep supplies. They watch weather more carefully than mainlanders do, and they look after each other, which on a small island counts as infrastructure. The sound between the island and the mainland has its own history of being harder than it looks. On the 1st of August, 1899, the same hurricane that left 9 houses standing in Carabel caught a fleet in the anchorage here. Contemporary accounts describe up to 15 ships wrecked, 12 of them loaded with lumber, plus another 40 vessels under 20 tons sunk or destroyed. Those wrecks are still down there, and they're still part of the island's geography in a very literal way. After Hurricane Michael in 2018, portions of 2 more shipwrecks, likely from that same 1899 event, came back out of the sand where the storm had rearranged the beach. That detail says something about this coast that I keep coming back to. The past here sits about a foot down in the sand, and every big storm shuffles the deck and deals a few cards face up. The island itself is moving too. The state's erosion inventory has most of Dog Island listed as eroding, including a stretch on the east end where private development has already been destroyed, and more remains threatened. Barrier islands in this part of the Gulf are thin, low, and mobile by nature, sitting on that gently sloping shelf with no significant supply of new sand arriving to replace what storms take away. At the far end of this island chain, past St. George, there's a second island in the same category, and it's stranger. St. Vincent Island sits at the western end of Apalachicola Bay, right where the river's influence meets the Gulf. It's roughly 18 square miles of ridges and swales, meaning long parallel sand ridges built by the sea over thousands of years, with wet troughs between them, covered in live oak and pine, with freshwater lakes in the middle of it. The oldest ridges are on the order of 3,000 years old, so the island is essentially a written record of its own construction. People have been using it for a very long time. Paleo-Indian material found there goes back something like 13,000 years. Franciscans put a name on it in 1633, and the British used it during the War of 1812. The Nature Conservancy bought it in 1968 for $2.2 million, and it became the St. Vincent National Wildlife Refuge. Nobody lives there. There's no bridge, no ferry service, no dock for the public, no drinking water. Access is by private boat, and that's it. The island also has an odd zoological footnote. In 1948, the previous private owners brought in sambar deer from Southeast Asia, and their descendants are still out there, sharing the island with native white-tailed deer and getting managed through limited annual hunts. Red wolves, among the rarest large carnivores on Earth, have been part of the refuge's conservation work. What matters for this list is the water between the island and the mainland. Indian Pass is narrow enough that on a calm day at the right stage of tide, it looks like an easy swim. And it is a tidal inlet, which means it obeys the same physics as Bob Sykes' Cut. A whole bay's worth of water drains through a gap that small twice a day, and the current in the middle of it can move faster than a person can swim against. An island you can practically shout across is still an island. So the ranking for these bridgeless islands is honest. Very few people, almost no incidents, and a hazard profile that's almost entirely about time and distance. But it's the purest example of a category that shows up over and over out here. Places where the water never has to do anything dramatic at all, because the ambulance, the fire truck, the pharmacy, and the second opinion are all on the far side of it. Number 12 was named the best beach in America a few years ago, which is a strange credential for a place on a list like this. And both facts are true at the same time. St. George Island runs about 28 miles from end to end and about a mile across at its widest point. 990 people lived there at the 2020 census, a number that multiplies several times over in season. The eastern 9 miles are a state park, undeveloped, with a campground and dunes and some of the cleanest sand on the Gulf. In 2023, the professor who publishes the annual American Beach Rankings put it at number 1 in the country. Getting there means the Bryant-Paton Bridge, which leaves the mainland at East Point and crosses roughly 4 miles of Apalachicola Bay. That's about 21,500 feet of structure with 65 feet of clearance in the middle for boats. It opened on the 27th of February, 2004, replacing a pair of aging bridges from 1965. And before those, there was a ferry, and before the ferry, there was nothing. One bridge. That's the entire relationship between this island and the rest of the world, which sets up the arithmetic that makes barrier island life on this coast fundamentally different from mainland life. When a hurricane is coming, everyone leaves across a single structure, and that structure stops being usable well before the storm arrives, because bridges get closed when sustained winds reach tropical storm force. High-profile vehicles go first, then everyone. The practical effect is that the evacuation deadline for an island is hours earlier than the deadline for a town 10 miles inland. And if a storm speeds up or shifts, those hours are the entire margin. Anyone who has been on the island during a serious watch knows the feeling. Nobody panics. What happens is a slow, orderly, deeply unnerving drain of traffic across 4 miles of water, boats coming off trailers and going back on, plywood going up, and then, at some point, nothing but wind and an empty bridge. On the mainland end of that bridge sits East Point, and it deserves a sentence of its own because visitors tend to drive through it at 45 miles an hour on the way to the beach. East Point is the working side of this bay. The seafood houses are there, strung along the water on pilings. The places where oysters got culled, shucked, packed, and iced, where shrimp got headed, where the fleet tied up. When the bay closed, that's the shoreline where the effect showed up first, in buildings with nothing to process. The island across the bridge has vacation rentals and a beach ranked best in America. The town at the foot of the bridge has the work. Both of those facts belong to the same estuary. West of the state park, there's a break in the island that isn't natural. In 1954, the Army Corps of Engineers dredged a ship channel straight across St. George Island to give the Apalachicola fishing fleet a direct route to the Gulf. It's called Bob Sykes Cut, and it did what it was designed to do. It saved boats a long run around the end of the island, and it's still in use. It also cut the island in two, and everything west of the cut became a separate island. Little St. George, sometimes called Cape St. George Island, which is now state-owned and undeveloped. A dredged inlet like that is a serious piece of water, and it's worth understanding why, because inlets are one of the most reliably dangerous places on any coast. All the water that fills a large shallow bay on a rising tide and drains off it on a falling one has to move through a small number of passes. Squeeze a bay's worth of water through a narrow gap twice a day, and you get a current that can run faster than a person can swim. Right next to a beach where the water looks completely ordinary. Add jetty rocks, boat traffic in a channel, and an outgoing tide against an onshore wind stacking up standing waves, and you have the classic combination, which is why the standing advice for any inlet, here or anywhere else, is to stay out of the water near it. Swim at the beach, well away from the pass and the jetties. If you're in a small boat, work the tide instead of fighting it, and treat an outgoing tide against a strong onshore wind as a reason to wait rather than an interesting challenge. The other thing about that cut is what it did over decades to the island west of it. And the evidence for that is a lighthouse that isn't there anymore. The Cape St. George Light has a history that reads like a slow-motion demolition. The first tower went up in 1833 near the island's west end. A second was built a couple of miles away in the 1840s, and a hurricane knocked it down in August of 1851. The third went up in 1852, set 250 yards back from the water, which everyone at the time considered a generous margin. Then the shoreline came for it. In 1995, Hurricane Opal washed out the sand around the base, shifted the tower partly off its footing and rotated it, leaving it leaning about 10 degrees. It stood like that, tilted, photographed by everybody who came out by boat, and became a kind of mascot for the whole coast. Hurricane George knocked it around again in 1998. In 2002, engineers straightened it and rebuilt the foundation. Erosion went right back to work on the new one. On the 22nd of October, 2005, it fell into the Gulf of Mexico. What happened next is the part I find genuinely moving. Volunteers went out to the collapse site and recovered 24,000 of the tower's 160,000 original bricks out of the water and cleaned them one at a time. Those bricks went into the interior lining of a rebuilt tower, put up in a county park in the middle of St. George Island, finished in the spring of 2008 and opened to the public that November. So the lighthouse that stood on the west end of a disappearing island now stands 2 islands over, in the middle of a town, made partly of itself. I said earlier that this coast keeps writing the same sentence. Here it is again, in a different hand. The state's erosion inventory lists severe erosion at Cape St. George on Little St. George Island, resulting in the loss of the historic pre-Civil War lighthouse, and notes that sea turtle nesting habitat west of the light was lost as the shoreline moved into the maritime forest and the beach virtually disappeared. Over on St. George Island proper, the entire developed stretch of the state park, 4.5 miles of it, is designated critically eroded after Hurricane Dennis in 2005. And when Hurricane Michael came through in 2018, sensors in Franklin County, including one at St. George Island State Park, recorded water levels of around 7.25 feet above mean higher high water on an island whose highest natural ground is a dune, none of which stops the island from being what it is on an ordinary Tuesday in April. 900 people, a couple of restaurants, a lighthouse in a park, pelicans working the surf line, and the best public beach in the country by at least one respectable ranking. The water in front of it is the last entry on this list. Number 13 is where we started, and now the road on the rocks means something different. Cape San Blas is the elbow of a hook. A long, thin peninsula runs north from it for about 15 miles, curling back toward the mainland and enclosing St. Joseph Bay, which is one of the clearest, calmest, most seagrass-rich bays in the northern Gulf, and the reason people come here with scallop nets every summer. The top of the peninsula is a state park with dunes tall enough to be surprising in Florida. The elbow itself sticks out into the Gulf, and everything the Gulf does along this coast, it does to that elbow first. St. Joseph Bay, on the inside of that hook, is worth understanding before we get to the outside, because it explains why anyone puts up with the outside. It's shallow, clear, and full of seagrass, which makes it one of the best bay scalloping grounds in Florida during the short summer season, when families anchor in 3 feet of water and snorkel around picking scallops off the grass by hand. It's also a nursery for a long list of species, and it holds sea turtles year-round. The bay is calm in a way the Gulf side never is, and the peninsula is the only reason it exists at all. Take away that thin arm of sand, and there is no bay, just open coast. The state's erosion inventory does not hedge about it. The west shoreline of Cape San Blas is severely eroded and is considered to have the highest erosion rate along the coast of Florida. A little over a mile of it, from Stump Hole up to the old Air Force facilities, is designated critically eroded, and the report specifically notes that the erosion has destroyed sea turtle nesting habitat there. The engineering history reads like a losing argument conducted over 40 years. After Hurricane Kate in 1985, the Air Force built a rock mound in front of the road leading to its facility on the Cape. Hurricane Opal destroyed both the rock mound and the road in 1995. That same storm forced the first rock structure at Stump Hole to keep the county road from going into the Gulf. Hurricanes Ivan in 2004 and Dennis in 2005 damaged it. In 2009, engineers replaced it with a heavier, purpose-built boulder structure meant to survive a major storm, which is the wall of rock that road still sits on today. Then, on the 10th of October 2018, Hurricane Michael cut 2 new inlets clean through the St. Joseph Peninsula and left part of the state park unreachable by vehicle. The Gulf simply opened 2 doors into the bay where there had been sand. And the lighthouses. There have been 4 of them out here, and their story is 175 years of the same conversation. The tower, finished in 1848, came down in a gale in August of 1851. Its replacement was lit in 1855, and a hurricane the following August drove waves against the floor of the keeper's dwelling, which stood 8 feet off the ground. The brick tower that followed was lit in 1859, and by 1869 the beach in front of it was disappearing. The Lighthouse Board asked for $5,000 for a jetty in 1875 and got 2. By 1881, the base of the tower was in the water and crews were laying brush mattresses in front of it, which the Gulf tore apart. On the 3rd of July, 1882, the undermined tower leaned, cracked, and fell, and afterward it lay in 8 feet of water about 200 feet offshore. The iron skeleton tower that replaced it in 1885 was deliberately set 1,500 feet back from the shoreline. 2 years later, the margin was 1,200 feet. By 1890, it was 144 feet. A gale in 1894 destroyed the keeper's dwellings and left the tower standing in water. A hurricane in 1916 stripped what beach was left, and by the next year the tower stood 120 feet offshore. So in 1918 they picked it up and moved it about 1,860 feet north, and relit it in January of 1919. 90-some years later, the Gulf had caught up again. Hurricane Isaac in 2012 left roughly 50 feet between the keeper's quarters and the water. In July of 2014, contractors lifted the tower, the 2 dwellings, and the oil house and hauled them about 12 miles up the road to a park in Port St. Joe, where you can climb the tower today and look out over a bay instead of a cape. There's a human detail in that lighthouse's records that I haven't been able to shake. In 1931, the keeper, a man named Ray Linton, pulled 2 men and a girl out of the water and saved their lives. 2 years later, he took his own, and the account from the time says the isolation and the wide, empty expanse of the Gulf had become too much to carry. 4 towers, and the thing that finally proved unsurvivable out there was the loneliness. So why does Cape San Blas rank in the low teens rather than the top of this list, when it is objectively the fastest eroding shoreline in the state? Because erosion, by itself, mostly kills buildings and roads. It gives you decades of warning. It shows up in reports and permits and insurance rates and painful county commission meetings, and people can and do respond to it. The specific way it turns dangerous to human beings is indirect. It puts a public road in a place where stormwater crosses it. It strands people past a breach. It removes the dune that would otherwise slow a surge, and it concentrates development into the narrow band of land that's left. That last sentence applies to the whole coast, so let me put it precisely. The peninsula is doing exactly what a barrier peninsula does. on a schedule that no longer lines up with a 30-year mortgage. Now back to that road at Stump Hole, with the boulders under it. The first time you drive it, it looks like an engineering solution. Once you know the history, it looks like a decision, renewed every few years, at real public expense, to keep a road going to a place people are unwilling to give up. That's what those rocks are. An argument in granite that this cape is worth the cost of reaching. They put a lighthouse on a cape 4 times, and then they moved the lighthouse to town. They've rebuilt the road on the cape over and over, and it's still there. You can read that as stubbornness. I've come to read it as a fairly clear statement of priorities. And the last 2 places on this list are the ones that test it hardest. Number 14 is a town of about 1,000 people at the western end of this coast, and on one October afternoon, it became the reference case for what the Gulf of Mexico can do to the Florida Panhandle. Mexico Beach was laid out in 1946 and incorporated in 1967. Before 2018, it had a little over 1,000 residents and a reputation among people who knew this coast as the last honest beach town in the region. No high-rises, no chain hotels on the sand, a collection of bungalows 50 years old and newer vacation houses. On stilts, a canal, a pier, a city hall, an elementary school, and a water tower. Families came back to the same rental for 20 summers. It was the kind of place people describe as old Florida without irony, because that's simply what it was. Hurricane Michael formed in the Caribbean in early October of 2018 and moved north across an unusually warm Gulf. The forecasts were good. Storm surge warnings went up along the Florida Gulf Coast about 36 hours before tropical storm force winds arrived, and the first official surge inundation forecast, issued days out, called for 7 to 11 feet above ground in the zone that included this stretch of shoreline. What the forecasts couldn't fully capture was the last 12 hours. Michael intensified right up to the coast, with no weakening cycle before landfall, which is a specific and dangerous behavior. A lot of people on this coast have a mental model built from experience, and the experienced model says storms usually shed some intensity in the final approach over shallow water. This one didn't. It went the other way. Near 12:30 Central Time, on the 10th of October, the eye came ashore near Tyndall Air Force Base and Mexico Beach. The National Hurricane Center's final report, published the following May, put the maximum sustained winds at landfall at 140 knots, which is 160 miles an hour, Category 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale, with a minimum central pressure of 919 millibars. That made Michael the first Category 5 hurricane to make landfall in the United States since Andrew in 1992, only the 4th on record, the strongest hurricane landfall ever recorded in the Florida Panhandle, and the 3rd lowest landfall pressure for any United States hurricane since records began in 1900. Then came the water. And the water is what this coast is about. A United States Geological Survey pressure sensor mounted on the Mexico Beach pier recorded a wave-filtered water elevation of 15.5 feet above the standard vertical datum, which converts to roughly 14 7/10 of a foot above the average high tide line. Surveyors later found a preserved seed line inside a multi-unit vacation rental building on the north side of U.S. Highway 98, 11.5 feet up the inside wall, in a building that itself sits a few feet above the waterline of the lagoon behind it. The conclusion in the official report is that normally dry ground near the high tide line in Mexico Beach took as much as 14 feet of storm surge, with significant waves running on top of that. 14 feet of salt water moving, with waves on it, through a town built only a few feet above sea level. In Mexico Beach, 1,584 of the town's 1,692 buildings were damaged, and 809 of them were destroyed. At Tyndall Air Force Base, where the eye came ashore, every building on the installation was damaged, and many were destroyed. Across Bay County, more than 45,000 structures were damaged, and more than 1,500 destroyed, including serious damage to 2 hospitals. In Gulf County next door, another 985 structures were destroyed. In Franklin County, 80 more. Coastal Highway was washed out in multiple places between Panama City and Alligator Point. The overall damage figure for the United States came to about $25 billion. And Michael didn't stop at the beach, which is the other thing this coast learned that day. The storm was still a major hurricane well inland. In Jackson County, Florida, an hour and a half north of the water, around 400 buildings were destroyed, and 600 more suffered major damage. Across the line in Seminole County, Georgia, a gust of 115 miles an hour was recorded at Donaldsonville. The swath of wind damage ran from the Panhandle across the corner of Alabama and deep into southwest Georgia, and it flattened timber and row crops across counties whose economies are timber and row crops. For a region where the coastal towns fish and the inland towns cut pine, one storm took both in an afternoon. 16 people died as a direct result of the storm across the southeast, 7 of them in Florida. 5 of those 7 drowned in the storm surge, 3 in or near Mexico Beach, 1 between Mexico Beach and Port St. Joe, and 1 near East Bay on the east side of Panama City. Every one of the surge victims was elderly, ranging from 60 to 91 years old. Every one of them was inside a designated storm surge evacuation zone. Another 43 deaths in Florida were classified as indirect, from falls during cleanup, traffic accidents, and medical conditions made worse by the storm and its aftermath. Roughly 285 people in Mexico Beach stayed. I've thought about that number a lot while putting this together, and I want to handle it carefully, because the easy version of this story is a lecture about people who ignored a warning. The real version is more complicated and more useful. Some of those people had ridden out every storm since the 60s in the same house and had never seen the Gulf come past the dune line. Some had nowhere to go, no vehicle, no money for a motel inland, or someone at home who couldn't easily be moved. Some were caring for a person on oxygen and made a judgment call about the risks of moving them. Evacuation is not a single decision made by a single healthy adult with a full tank of gas. It's a logistics problem, and the people who fail it are usually the ones with the fewest resources, which is exactly what the age range of those victims suggests. Which is why the guidance that matters here goes past the words "leave when you're told." If you live on a surge coast, decide in advance where you would go and who you would take, because on the day of, that decision is made in the middle of a crowded highway with a forecast that is changing. And check on the neighbor who is 84 and lives alone, because in a small town on this coast, that neighbor is the statistic. What happened afterward is the part that says the most about this coast. The 2020 census counted 916 people in Mexico Beach, down about 15% from 10 years earlier. The town rebuilt anyway, with federal money and local money, and a great deal of arguing, and by the 6-year mark, county leaders were describing the population as recovered. Anyone who knew it before will tell you it's a different town now. Rebuilding after a storm like that means building to current code, which means higher pilings, stronger connections, better roofs, and higher costs. And the 50-year-old bungalows that gave the place its character were mostly not rebuilt as 50-year-old bungalows. They couldn't be. That's the quiet toll that never makes a damage table. A storm can take a town's building stock in an afternoon. What it takes over the following decade is the price point that let ordinary families own a piece of the coast in the first place. The Gulf did that with about 10 minutes of maximum wind and a couple of hours of high water. The 8 years since have done the rest, slowly, through insurance rates, construction costs, and the arithmetic of who can afford to come back. Number 15 has no address, no sign, and no parking lot. It's the water itself from the last 20 yards of dry sand out across the shelf, and it touches every other place on this list. Start with the part that kills the most people, which is also the part that looks the most harmless. A rip current is the drain. Waves break, they push water up onto the beach, and all of that water has to get back out. On a beach with sandbars, it collects and returns seaward through a gap in the bar, in a narrow channel moving fast. NOAA measures rip currents at speeds up to 8 feet per second, which is faster than an Olympic swimmer can sprint. Roughly 100 people a year die in them in the United States by NOAA's estimate. The National Weather Service also keeps a running tally of surf zone deaths, and its own page says plainly that the number is an undercount because many drownings never get reported into that system. In the preliminary count for this year, 46 surf zone deaths had been logged nationally, 10 of them in Florida. The typical victim across years of that data is male and between 10 and 29, and most of these deaths happen in June and July. The cruelty of a rip current is that it doesn't look like anything. The surface in the channel is often calmer than the water on either side, because the waves aren't breaking there. To a person standing on the beach deciding where to put the kids, that flat patch looks like the safe spot. It's the opposite. And this coast has a specific complication. On the big Florida beach destinations, there are lifeguard towers, a flag system everybody recognizes, and staff whose entire job is watching the water. On most of the forgotten coast, there's a beach, a dune walkover, and whoever else happened to show up that morning. That's a large part of the appeal. It also means the safety margin is whatever the swimmer brought with them. So the full version of the guidance, including the branch that gets skipped and is the one that kills grown adults, goes like this. Swim at a beach with lifeguards when you can. The Weather Service's own figure for your chances of drowning at a guarded beach is about 1 in 18 million, which is one of the great arguments for driving the extra 20 minutes. Check the beach forecast and the flags before you go in, and understand that conditions change through the day. Never swim alone. If you get caught in a rip current, the first thing is the hardest. Don't fight it. The current pulls you away from shore, and it does not pull you under. Swimming straight back toward the beach against it is what exhausts people, and exhaustion is what drowns them. Stay calm, float, or tread water, and let it carry you until it weakens, which it does, usually within a few dozen yards of shore. Then swim parallel to the beach to get out of the channel, and only then angle back in with the waves helping you. If you can't get out of it, keep floating, face the shore, and wave your arms and yell so somebody can see you. And if you see somebody else caught in one, do not swim out to them. That is the branch that turns one drowning into two, and it happens constantly, usually to a parent or a friend who is a decent swimmer and completely unprepared for what a rip current does. Get a lifeguard. Call 911. Throw them something that floats, a cooler lid, a boogie board, an inflatable anything, and keep talking to them so they stay calm and stay above water. That last instruction comes straight out of the accumulated record of what happens to would-be rescuers. Second thing in this water, and it arrives on the wind. Red tide on the Gulf Coast of Florida is a bloom of a single-celled organism called Karenia brevis, which occurs naturally in the Gulf and which produces compounds called brevetoxins. Blooms tend to form in late summer and early fall and can last anywhere from a few weeks to more than a year. One bloom that started in November of 2017 ran until February of 2019. When the surf breaks up the cells, the toxins get into the sea spray, and an onshore wind carries that inland. What people experience is coughing, sneezing, and burning eyes, nose, and throat. For most healthy people, it's miserable and temporary, and it stops when they leave the beach. For someone with asthma or chronic lung disease, and for young children and older adults, it can be a genuine medical problem. State guidance is to avoid swimming in or around a red tide because skin and eye irritation are common, and to check the current status before making the drive, since blooms are patchy and can be bad at one beach and absent 5 miles away. There's a seafood side to this that gets garbled constantly, so let me be precise. Commercially harvested shellfish is safe because harvest areas get closed and product gets tested before it can be sold. The risk sits with recreational harvest, which is prohibited in closed areas during a bloom, and that prohibition exists for a reason. Fish caught alive and healthy can be eaten if they're filleted, and the guts discarded. Dead or distressed fish should be left alone. Third thing, and it's the one that produces the scariest headlines and the most confused thinking. Vibrio vulnificus is a bacterium that lives naturally in warm, brackish salt water. This coast is warm, brackish salt water for most of the year, so it's here, in the same way that it's along the whole Gulf. It reaches people two ways, by eating raw or undercooked shellfish, oysters in particular, and by getting into an open wound that's exposed to seawater. Now the part that matters, and this is the denominator problem in a nutshell. The Florida Department of Health publishes case counts. In 2024, there were 82 cases in the state and 19 deaths. In 2025, 33 cases and 5 deaths. So far this year, through the middle of August, 15 cases and 2 deaths. Those figures cover the entire state of Florida, with more than 20 million residents and well over 100 million visitors a year. Measured as a risk to any individual person going in the water, it is extremely small. Measured as a disease, though, it's serious in a way that justifies the attention. A bloodstream infection with this organism kills roughly half the people who get one, and about 1 in 5 people infected overall die, sometimes within a day or two of getting sick. And the risk is not evenly spread. People with chronic liver disease, kidney disease, cancer, diabetes, or a weakened immune system are dramatically more likely to develop the severe form. One study found people with those underlying conditions were something like 80 times more likely to develop a bloodstream infection from it. So the official prevention guidance splits along exactly that line, and both halves matter. If you have liver disease, a compromised immune system, or another chronic condition on that list, do not eat raw oysters or raw shellfish, and do not go into warm salt or brackish water with an open wound, including a fresh tattoo or a recent surgical site. For everyone, cook shellfish properly, which means boiling shells until they open, and then 5 more minutes, or steaming for about 9 minutes, or boiling shucked oysters for at least 3 minutes. Keep raw seafood and its juices away from cooked food. Wear gloves when handling raw shellfish, because shell cuts are one of the classic exposure routes. Cover any wound with a waterproof bandage before going in the water, and if you get a cut in salt water, wash it thoroughly with soap, and clean water afterward. And the piece people skip. If a wound exposed to seawater becomes red, swollen, and painful quickly, get medical care immediately and tell them about the exposure. With this organism, the difference between a bad week and a catastrophe is measured in hours. Then there's the geometry of the shelf itself, which plays a specific trick on boaters that doesn't happen on most coasts. Because the bottom drops off so gradually, a person can run 20 miles offshore here and still be in 30 or 40 feet of water, over grass flats and limestone bottom, with the shoreline a thin gray smudge behind them. It feels safe because the water is shallow and the land is theoretically right there. Shallow water is not the same thing as close water. 20 miles is 20 miles, whether it's 40 feet deep or 400. And if an engine quits, the wind is offshore, and the sun is going down, that smudge stops being reassuring very quickly. This part of the Gulf also lacks the visual references boaters rely on elsewhere. There's no headland, no ridge, no skyline. Out on the Big Bend, 3 separate directions look identical, which is why every safe boater out here does the same unremarkable things. They tell somebody on shore where they're going and when they'll be back. They carry a marine radio, rather than trusting a cell phone that has no signal 10 miles out. Many of them carry a registered emergency beacon because it turns a search across hundreds of square miles into a trip to a set of coordinates. They keep life jackets accessible, and they watch the afternoon sky in summer, because on this coast, a thunderstorm will build in an hour over water that was glass at noon. There's a fourth hazard out here that belongs in any honest accounting, and it arrives from directly overhead. Lightning kills around 20 people a year in the United States, and Florida gets more thunderstorm days than anywhere else in the country. The reason is the same sea breeze that makes summer afternoons on this coast so reliable. Warm, humid air rising over a peninsula, caught between two bodies of water, producing storms almost daily from June into September. The exposure that matters is being on open water, on a beach, on a dock, or on a golf course when one of those cells builds, and they build fast. The guidance is simple, and it's the same everywhere, which is why it's worth repeating. When you hear thunder, get inside a substantial building or a hard-topped vehicle and stay there for 30 minutes after the last rumble. On a boat, that means heading in early, rather than watching the sky and negotiating with yourself, because a small, open boat on a shallow shelf is the tallest thing for a long way in every direction. And the last hazard in this water is the one that ties the whole list together. That shallow shelf that amplifies storm surge also sits in the sun. In late summer, the water over it is bathwater warm to a considerable depth, and warm water is fuel for hurricanes. Michael crossed that water and intensified all the way to the coast. Idalia, in August of 2023, rapidly intensified over the same Gulf, reached Category 4, and came ashore near Keaton Beach as a Category 3, with winds around 115 miles an hour, driving 8 to 12 feet of water over the ground from Keaton Beach down to Steinhatchee. That storm ranks as the third strongest on record to hit the Big Bend, behind the Cedar Key hurricane of 1896 and Hurricane Easy in 1950. Helene, in 2024, crossed it as a Category 4, moving at 24 miles an hour, which is highway speed for a hurricane, and put 15 feet of water into communities down the coast. The same physical property, warm, shallow water on a wide, flat shelf, is what makes the fishing good, the swimming pleasant, the scalloping possible, the bacteria happy, the algae bloom, and the hurricanes strong. It's one system with one set of properties, and this coast lives inside all of them at once. That's why it's number 15. Every other place on this list is dangerous because of what this water does when it gets there, which leaves the thing I said I'd come back to. On the 1st of January of this year, for the first time since the summer of 2020, it became legal again to take a wild oyster out of Apalachicola Bay. The Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission voted to reopen it after 5 years of closure and more than $38 million of restoration work in the bay. The season ran from the 1st of January to the end of February. Commercial harvesters needed a new bay-specific endorsement. Recreational harvesters had to win a permit in a lottery, and applications were taken in the 6 weeks before Christmas. The limits tell you exactly how fragile this is. Only reefs that surveyed at a minimum threshold of 400 bags of legal-sized oysters could be opened at all. On the reefs that qualified, the harvest was capped at 10% of what was there. Across the entire commercial fleet, something like 4,700 bags were available for the season. And recreational permit holders got 1 bag apiece. Reporting from the first week of the season put it at roughly 31 bags per person for the whole 2 months. Nobody quit their day job. Boats went out anyway, at first light on New Year's Day, out of Apalachicola and East Point, into a bay that had been closed for 5 years. Some of them had 3 generations aboard one skiff. Roger Mathis, 68 years old, who started tonging when he was 6 and who shut down his oyster house during the closure and took whatever work he could find, went out and came back and said he'd never seen oysters so big out there. One oysters woman put it about as plainly as it can be put. It's in our blood. It's our legacy. I want to be straight with you about what that season was and wasn't, because it would be easy to end this on a swell of music. It was not a recovered fishery. By the estimate cited in the reporting around the reopening, the bay's oyster habitat has gone from something on the order of 10,000 acres to fewer than 500 since the 1980s. 2 months and a few thousand bags is a controlled test with a great deal riding on it. Run under harvest rules, built to be adjusted every year based on what the surveys find. The next season is scheduled to run from October into February, and whether it happens the way it's drawn up depends on the reefs, the river, the weather, and a series of decisions in Tallahassee. What it was, though, was people going back to work on their own water. That's the honest ending for this coast, and it's more interesting than the two versions that usually get written about places like this. One version is a paradise being destroyed, the other is stubborn people refusing to read the writing on the wall. What's actually down there is a specific set of trade-offs that a few thousand people evaluate every year and keep accepting. One number surprised me more than anything else in all of this because it runs against the story everybody expects. These counties are not emptying out. Franklin County counted 12,451 people in the 2020 census, and the most recent estimate puts it above 13,000. Gulf County counted a bit over 14,000, and the recent estimate is closer to 16. After a Category 5 hurricane, Sammy Danak hurricanes, a 5-year fishery closure, an insurance market that gets harder every year, and a coastline that keeps rearranging itself, more people live on the forgotten coast now than did at the start of the decade. Some of that is retirees. Some of it is remote work. Some of it is people who came down after the storms to rebuild and stayed. But whatever the mix, it means the decisions in this story are being made by more people every year, not fewer. What living here actually requires right now in practical terms is a set of skills that most Americans don't have to develop. Knowing what the water is doing before you get in it. Leaving early when the county says leave because the road out floods before the storm arrives. Understanding that your house is insured on terms set by people in another state looking at a map of this shelf. Keeping a boat that starts. Knowing which neighbor is 84 and lives alone. Making a living out of narrow windows. A Tupelo bloom that lasts 2 weeks. A scallop season. A 2-month oyster season. A summer of visitors. A fall of storms. And accepting that the road on the Cape will wash out again and be rebuilt again. On rocks that were barged in to buy time. That's the part that got me, working through all of this. Every single place on this list is a negotiation. The lighthouse moved 4 times and then moved to town. The bay closed and reopened under rules written in bags per person. The forest is being unditched a few thousand acres at a time. The dead lakes came back when the dam came out. The road exists because a county keeps deciding it should. Nothing here is settled, and nobody down here talks like it is. 15 places, 1 system, and the same answer at every stop. The water arrives, and people decide what to do next. I'd like to know which of the 15 landed hardest for you because I went back and forth about the order more than once. And there's a decent case that the flooded cave under Wakulla or the bay itself belongs at the top. And if you know this coast, if you grew up in East Point or spent childhood summers on Alligator Point or had a grandfather who tonged oysters, the comment section is a better archive of these places than anything I could assemble on my own. So put in the detail that only shows up when a person has actually stood in it. If this was worth your time, a like helps other people find it. And subscribing is the simplest way to say that work built this way deserves an audience. And if you drive down there this fall, watch the water. Ask somebody local before you swim. And buy your oysters from the people who tonged them.